Now, our final guest, our cleanup hitter, let's bring in Larry Summers. Summers is the former president of Harvard, serves on the board of directors of the Peterson Institute. He's also Treasury Secretary under President Clinton, director of the National Economic Council under President Obama. Larry, welcome.
Glad to be with you. Glad to be with you, Ron, and glad to be with all the great organizations, Emerson, Churchill, Peterson, Chatham House, that are sponsoring this terrific event.
Well, let's start with the question. I think many people in the U.S. in our audience, I'm sure, are asking, what is the key or the keys to getting the economy back on its feet and functioning again? What are the most important things that have to happen before that can happen?
There's one thing that's overwhelmingly more important than anything else, and that's getting this virus under control. You can have whatever fiscal or monetary policy you want. You can have an interest rate of -7%. If people are scared to go outside, they're scared to go out to the store, they're scared to be near each other, you're not going to have a decently functioning economy, no matter what fiscal and monetary policy you have. You need a strategy for getting to therapy or vaccine as rapidly as possible. That's at a Manhattan Project level, not at a regular biology kind of level. And we need to be doing aggressively some combination of masking, testing, and tracing. And we're unfortunately not doing that. So I think that the outlook for the next year and a half right now is pretty grim.
Yeah. What would it take to get to that level of testing? Is it something that can be handled in a decentralized manner, that it's now largely unfolding, or does it need more of a kind of command and control central direction from the federal government?
It's much more command and control, because here's the problem. What you need to do is pursue every avenue, knowing that some of them will end up being wasteful. And nobody's going to start making a test if the rules are that there's only a 1 in 5 chance that their test is going to be the one that goes mass production. And in the event that it does go mass production, everybody's going to say it's criminal if they make a huge profit margin on it. In that decentralized standard market model, nobody's going to go for it. So what you need is some combination of guaranteeing people against losses, since the most likely thing, if you pursue the right redundancy strategy, is that there will be people whose thing won't get to the end. You need to insure them against those losses, or you need to ensure that there'll be politically and socially acceptable immense rewards for the people who succeed. I think the second is very hard, because I don't think we want to pay huge profit margins once there is a successful test. So you need a central government approach to making it worthwhile for entrepreneurs to take that risk. And you can't get that from 50 states operating separately. So it's a very clear example of market failure, and it's why we fundamentally didn't outsource to the private sector the Manhattan Project. That's the kind of problem we have, and it was obvious then that you couldn't decentralize it and do it for the do it with the private sector, and unfortunately, we're not understanding that now.
I remember sitting in your office in the White House in 2009, and it is a way to point out that you had a front row seat at the process of digging out from the 2008 financial crash. When you look at that experience, how long do you think it's going to take before we feel that we are, quote, something like back to normal and the economy is working again? Are we talking about months? Are we talking about years before we feel as though we are back to where we were before this outbreak began?
Years. To start with, in that crisis, unemployment went from 5 to 10. In this crisis, unemployment's going to go from 3.5 to 15 or more. So it's more than twice as large a descent. We're going to have a major force making things hard for a year and a half at least, until we have a vaccine or therapy. And then we're going to have all the problems that economies have in restoring themselves to growth. So I would guess that it will not be that things will feel completely normal in the next presidential term. I think they will feel, with even modestly good luck, they will feel much better than they do right now 2 or 3 years from now. They'll probably feel better than they do right now in 18 months. But this is going to define the economic policy debate.
Mm-hmm.
I think the most important way in which my thinking has changed, and there were some people who are ahead of me on this, but also some who's changed at the same time, is this is not like a big earthquake. Ben Bernanke suggested, and I doubt he'd make this suggestion today, that this was like some kind of big, immense snowstorm, that while it was there, screwed everything up, and then the snow cleared away and things returned to normal. I think the two facts that the virus is going to be with us for a long time. My guess is that we're in the bottom of the second or the top of the third inning with respect to our experience with the virus, and the fact that when you have large-scale unemployment, when you have substantial financial dislocations, when you have substantial building up of debt, those things take time to work off. I think it's going to be a long time.
Larry, real quick, I want to go to the audience questions, but are we looking at a level of economic damage in the US and around the world that will be comparable to the Great Depression of the 1930s? Or not that big?
I hope not. And with reasonable skill in combating the virus, and with reasonably sensible policies, it should not be of quite that consequence in the industrial world. But that is not an irrelevant comparison in thinking about it. I think it is likely to be a significantly more damaging event in many senses than the 2008 financial crisis, but not all the way to the Great Depression. But I fear that the downside risks relative to that forecast may be greater than the upside possibilities.
Yeah. A question. Let me ask you a question from Ann Cormack submitted, going back to your first answer, talking about the need for kind of a federal unified approach. What about a pan-governmental approach to finding suitable tests and, most importantly, a vaccine? Seems to me no one government can manage this alone. Should governments work together? And what would that take?
Yes, and there are various scientific and biomedical cooperations. I think if we wait for governments to negotiate the cost sharing on some pan-governmental approach, it'll be months before we get started. I think as the United States, we should be spending money on developing the vaccine and developing the therapies, and thinking that if that benefits, there'll be a very large goodwill benefit from that. So I'm all for all forms of cooperation, but if we wait for the ideal of cooperation, we'll get started too slowly.
As I asked some of our previous speakers, I mean, one of the striking things about this entire experience is that many of the jobs that have been proven to be essential to the functioning of our economy were, before this all began, in some ways among the most disposable in our economy, with the lowest compensation, the least security, the most meager benefits. Do you think this is going to change the debate about what the floor is of compensation and security and benefits that every worker deserves? Do you think that's going to happen in the U.S., or is we're going to be in the same place we've always been in terms of things like raising the minimum wage or ensuring access to health care or paid sick leave?
I think this will accelerate the day when we raise the minimum wage. I think it will accelerate the time when family and medical leave comes. I think this will push us in the direction of more social protection. I think in the broadest sense, Ron, this is going to be the final nail in the coffin of the Reagan-Thatcher libertarian wave. I think that wave, which came in 1980, in many ways had crested some years ago and was receding. And I think this kind of demonstration that there are massive problems for all our security that we can't, as people, deal with alone, that our towns and cities can't deal with as people alone. I think that is going to change that libertarian ethos. And as it changes that libertarian ethos, it will ripple through our politics to lead to a much more generous approach to the people who do the hardest and in many ways most important work of our society. You know, when I was Treasury Secretary, I used to every year in Washington, Veterans Day was a federal holiday, but it wasn't a school holiday where my kids went to school, and it was when the parents could go visit the classes. And I would sit and watch what these teachers did all day. And I thought, God, they had a much, much harder job. Being alone in a room, having to hold the interest and stimulate 30, 12-year-olds, that was a much, much harder job than the job I had. And I think this is going to lead to some greater appreciation, and here's the crucial sentence, of people who do vital work for which there may not be a standard business model that makes it profitable, but is nonetheless the most vital work of our country.
You know, Barbara Weber, one of our viewers, has a question that is really a follow-up on that. And I mentioned paid sick leave, minimum wage. She asked what policy proposals would reduce the worst consequences of economic inequality and avert the descent into poverty for millions of people. Which policies do you think is the most effective and politically feasible? And let me throw my own little addition on that. As you point out, this may extend into the next, this will extend into the next presidency. If a Democrat wins the presidency, the attitude of Republicans in Congress about massive stimulus spending, as you know, may change quite a bit. Is there a way, or should Democrats be thinking about ways to lock in future spending today while it's still in the interest of a Republican president to have it occur?
It may be that there are ways of doing that. I'm not sure we see the future clearly enough to legislate for the very long term in the next several months. Ron, look, I think I'd emphasize two things, but there are many. I'd emphasize turning unemployment insurance into employment insurance, having a much more generous, much more automatically triggered system for unemployment or employment insurance that's focused on giving people the transitional help they need, that integrates ideas like work sharing for people who can only work part-time, that integrates issues of training for people who are between jobs, and turning it into a much more positive springboard towards future employment. And the broad thing, and your previous guests all talked about this, and I know it's something that Churchill and Emerson are very much engaged around, and there should be public support for this, is investing in the human capital of our workforce with the same energy that we try to build up our nation's financial capital. You know, we have had for hundreds of years what I call the fuel tank model of education. The fuel tank model of education is when you're a kid, you go to school, maybe you go to junior high school, maybe you go to high school, then maybe you go to college, whatever. And then you leave school and you know a bunch of stuff. And then you work and gradually your knowledge becomes more obsolete and you sort of run out and then you retire and then you're done. And that model is fundamentally wrong in a world that is changing much more rapidly than the world used to change. And we need models that provide for continuous education. Much of that is going to be the job of employers. More of that than in the past is going to depend upon the individual initiative of workers in terms of getting trained. There's going to be an important role for government. But if you ask what's the most fundamental change in education that's going to take place, education is going to stop being a thing you accumulate and then decumulate. It's going to be something you're going to need to be absorbing throughout your life. And that's not just for like people like you and me reading new books. That's going to be for everybody, no matter what they do.
Let me ask you one final thing. We've talked quite a bit about the 2008 crash, and here we are 12 years later with a global catastrophe. Again, two events that might have been considered once in a century floods happening within 12 years of each other. I'm wondering, do you think our intricately connected, our intensely networked world that we are now living in, is it more inherently vulnerable to these kinds of global disruptions? Are these kinds of shocks to the system perhaps something that are going to come more often in a world as tightly connected as we are now?
Well, I think one of the responses is going to be to make the world a little less tightly connected. We're going to see some moves towards deglobalization. I think there may be tendencies in exactly the direction you're describing, Ron, but I think one has to think about it carefully. Before there were jumbo jets, there were never any airline crashes that killed 300 people. But all things considered, the world is a much safer and more progressive place because there were large jets developed. And the fact that we probably are more prone to some of these accidents, I don't think counsels that we should go back to the old way, which is a way where people didn't live as long. You know, relative to the time you mentioned a generation ago, the chance that a child born on planet Earth will die before the age of 5 is only half of what it was one generation ago. I think we need to be very careful here about throwing out some very valuable things, even as we try to get things under control. So my view is we need a kind of managed global integration and managed for the benefit of everybody, not for the benefit of elites, rather than a kind of isolation and gradual isolation of different countries.
Well, Larry, as always, you have given us a lot to think about. Larry, thank you. Sadia Zahidi, thank you. Rachel Carlson, thank you. Wendy Kopp, thanks as well. Thanks again to our underwriter, the Churchill Capital Corp, for supporting this program. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Ron Brownstein for The Atlantic, and we will see you all again next week. And thanks again, Larry.